Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Imagine a girl no more than 9 years old. Her hands still small, her voice still the fragile tone of childhood, yet she carried a secret that would horrify even the most hardened doctor. She was pregnant, not by a boy her age, not by the distant stranger of a violent crime, but by her own blood, by her uncle. This isn't a rumor whispered in passing, or a ghost tale meant to frighten children into obedience. It is a documented case buried deep in the archives of America's forgotten places. A story of poverty, isolation, and silence so thick that no one dared speak of it for decades. The girl's life was not her own, her innocence consumed by the same family that should have protected her, and the world around her looked away. In the early 20th century, when doctors, school teachers, and ministers encountered cases like these, the record-keeping was vague, the language clinical, the details hidden behind polite euphemisms. But beneath the softened words lay the raw truth. Communities across America knew of inbred families. They knew of fathers marrying daughters, of cousins producing entire lineages, of children born with crooked faces, twisted spines, and minds forever marked by the sins of their parents. Yet, they let it continue. The girl at the center of this story was different. Her case spread briefly, whispered by those who stumbled across it, because her condition was too shocking to ignore. She was not just a product of inbreeding, she was the living embodiment of a cycle of corruption and secrecy that had persisted for generations. Her body carried proof of everything a community wanted to bury, and so they buried her story instead. Tony, Gat, we're going to exhume it. This is not simply the story of a child, it is the story of what happens when isolation collides with desperation, when families turn inward to preserve bloodlines, and when silence becomes the most dangerous weapon of all. What you are about to hear will disturb you, not because it is strange, but because it happened, and because pieces of it still happen today, in places people dare not look. The town where this story unfolded was small, almost invisible on a map. One of those Appalachian or rural southern places where every face was familiar, and yet secrets could stretch like shadows across generations. Poverty pressed down hard. Families worked the soil with hands cracked by sun and hunger. Education was scarce, and outsiders rarely came. In places like this, bloodlines twisted inward, turning in on themselves like a snake devouring its own body. The girl belonged to a family already marked by whispers. They lived on the edge of the community, both geographically and socially. Their home was little more than a shack patched together with rotting wood and rusted tin. To neighbors, they were a spectacle, strange, quiet, a clan that didn't mix with others, whose children bore the unmistakable features of long-kept blood ties. Faces too symmetrical in the wrong places, eyes that crossed without focus, and bodies stunted in growth. To the locals, it was easier to laugh, to call them names, than to face what it really meant. Within those four walls, the girl's childhood was stolen. Her uncle, a man who should have been her protector, was instead her violator. In a family where the lines between father, cousin, brother, and uncle blurred into indistinguishable shame, such acts did not shock them. They were accepted, excused, ignored. To outsiders, the very thought would be monstrous, but to them, it was simply the way things had always been. When she began to show signs of pregnancy, the family closed ranks. Neighbors noticed her belly swelling before her 10th birthday, but few dared to ask questions. Those who did were met with cold stares or muttered lies. She had a stomach condition, they said. She was just big for her age. The truth, however, could not be hidden forever. A child cannot carry another child without the community taking notice, and so his story began to leak. Doctors were called in silence, summoned not for justice, but for shame control. In their reports, the words were sterile, stripped of emotion. They noted her age, her condition, and the genetic wreckage she carried. They did not linger on the horror of it, nor the tragedy. They simply wrote what they saw, and then turned the page. For them, it was easier that way. For her, it was a life sentence. The question we must ask is this: was she a victim of one man's depravity, or was she the inevitable result of an entire community choosing silence? The pregnancy itself was treated like a curse, not a miracle of life, not a family celebration, but a living symbol of everything that had been festering for generations. Imagine the scene: a girl of 9, her body too small, her bones too fragile to endure what lay ahead, now carrying a life forced upon her. Every step she took must have felt like carrying a weight that did not belong to her. The whispers grew louder in town, but still no one confronted the truth. Doctors feared the complications. At 9, her pelvis was not fully developed. Her body was not built for childbirth. The chances of survival, both for her and the child, were slim. Yet the pregnancy continued, because in those years there was little choice. There were no protective agencies stepping in, no authorities willing to intervene. In many ways, she was abandoned by both her family and the larger world. Those who saw her described her as frail, wide-eyed and silent. She did not speak much, and when she did, her words carried the weight of someone decades older. Children in situations like hers often aged overnight. They lost the innocence of laughter and games, replacing it with a kind of quiet resignation. She had been forced into adulthood without ever having been allowed to be a child. When she finally gave birth, the silence around her deepened. Accounts suggest the infant bore the unmistakable marks of its lineage, features too close to the family's own, deformities whispered about but never officially recorded. Was the child her cousin, her nephew, her son? In families like this, the bloodlines twisted so tightly that the answer hardly mattered anymore. What mattered was that another generation had been stamped with the seal of silence, deformity, and shame. For the girl, the experience left her body broken and her spirit crushed. She returned to the same home where the crime had happened. Forced to live beside those who had taken everything from her. There was no escape, no protection, no justice. She was left to raise a child born of abuse while still being a child herself. And outside, the community turned away, as if silence could erase what they all knew. Her story is disturbing, not only because of what happened, but because it exposes a truth people would rather forget. These were not isolated events. Cases like hers dotted the rural landscape of America. Each time the names were buried, the files locked away, and the victims left voiceless. She is remembered not as an individual, but as a chilling example of what happens when inbreeding and secrecy combine into something unthinkable. By the time whispers of her pregnancy reached beyond her community, it was too late to change anything. The story trickled into medical journals, into courthouse files, into the memories of those who dared to acknowledge it. But for the girl herself, there was no escape, only the cruel routine of survival. She grew older, but she never truly lived. Neighbors remembered seeing her carrying the infant in her arms, her small frame barely able to hold the weight. Some claimed she looked less like a mother and more like a child forced to play house, trapped in a role written by someone else. Others avoided looking at her altogether, as if eye contact might expose their own complicity in her suffering. To acknowledge her reality meant admitting what had been happening in the hills, in the valleys, in the hidden pockets of rural America for generations, and most people did not have the courage to face it. Her uncle, the man who had fathered the child, never faced punishment. Like many men in similar cases, he blended back into the family structure, shielded by silence and denial. In those times, blood was both a shield and a prison. Families closed ranks against outsiders, and if the cost was the destruction of a child, then so be it. Their reputation mattered more than her suffering. It's important to understand that the story of this girl is not simply about one act of violence. It is about a cycle. Generations of cousins marrying cousins, uncles preying on nieces, fathers laying claim to daughters. In the most isolated corners of America, the family tree was not a branching structure, but a circle closing in on itself. And from that circle came children like her, born into bodies too fragile, minds too fractured, and lives too cursed to ever find peace. The girl's case became a symbol, though not in the way you might expect. Doctors and investigators used her story as a warning, proof of what happens when bloodlines collapse inward. She was reduced to an example, a statistic, a footnote in the discussion of genetic decline. But to those who truly saw her, she was a tragedy written in flesh. She was the cost of silence. Think of it, a 9-year-old child forced into motherhood, carrying a child that was also her cousin, her nephew, and her son. The kind of equation that defies logic, but was all too common in these forgotten places. And yet, despite the horror of it, her story is not unique. There were others. She was simply the one who could not be ignored. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The girl's life after childbirth became a long shadow, one that stretched through the years without light. Accounts of her fate are fragmented, scattered in half-remembered whispers, sealed records, and medical case notes that speak more about biology than about suffering. But the fragments form a pattern. She was not protected. She was not saved. She was folded back into the same household where the abuse had begun. The child she bore grew under the same roof, its existence both a living reminder and a continuation of the cycle. Some sources claim the infant was frail, bearing physical deformities that made survival uncertain. Others say the child lived, but lived marked, carrying in its face and body the unmistakable signatures of generations of inbreeding. Whichever account is true, the reality is the same. Her suffering was not an endpoint, but a passing of the torch, one generation's silence feeding into the next. And yet, the story of this girl cannot be told without acknowledging the psychological toll. Imagine being 9, carrying a secret that most adults could not bear, and then being expected to raise a child born of violence. She never had the chance to be free of the crime against her, because she lived beside it. She saw it at the dinner table. She felt it in every quiet room of that shack. Trauma does not vanish when hidden. It embeds itself into the bones of a family. And hers was a family already brittle, already warped by generations of secrecy. When outsiders finally pieced together what had happened, they didn't intervene with compassion or justice. Instead, they treated her like a specimen. Doctors used her as an example, a way to lecture others on the dangers of close kin breeding. Journalists, when they dared write of it, spoke not of her humanity, but of the grotesque spectacle. She became a case file, a cautionary tale, a nameless victim held up as proof of genetic decline. And so her identity was erased twice, once by her family, who reduced her to a vessel for their cycle, and once by the world, which reduced her to a lesson in biology. That is the cruelty of stories like hers. The person disappears, and all that remains is the horror. In the years that followed, her life slipped further into obscurity. Few dared to record what became of her in detail, but the silence itself speaks volumes. Victims like her rarely left their hometowns. They rarely found freedom, and even more rarely found voices strong enough to break through the wall of shame that surrounded them. If she lived into adulthood, and the scattered accounts suggest she did, it would have been under the same roof that betrayed her, still bound to the same family that destroyed her. But what makes her story unbearable is that it was not unusual. Across Appalachia, the Ozarks, and the hidden valleys of Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia, similar cases emerged. Families so isolated that they forgot where kinship ended and taboo began. Generations marrying into themselves, each new child carrying the compounded weight of deformities, mental decline, and inherited sorrow. And when outsiders discovered them, they treated them not with protection, but with ridicule. They were photographed, mocked, and written about as freaks of nature, their humanity erased in favor of curiosity. The girl's pregnancy by her uncle is remembered because it shocked even those desensitized by the era's silence. But how many others were buried without record? How many children carried the same burden, hidden away in mountains and hollows where no doctor dared to intervene? For every one that history accidentally captured, there were likely dozens more erased before their stories could surface. Think about the cruelty of that kind of erasure. She carried a child before she carried her own 10th birthday. She gave birth before she ever held a doll. And then, when her name could have been remembered, it was taken from her, leaving only the gruesome facts, stripped of context, stripped of humanity. There's a reason communities bury stories like this. Because to admit them is to admit failure, not just of one family, but of an entire town, an entire system, an entire society. The silence that allowed her uncle to continue, the neighbors who looked away, the doctors who filed reports without justice, the state that ignored it. It wasn't only one man who failed her, it was everyone. Her life stands as a mirror. When we look into it, we see the rot that grows when silence is chosen over truth, when shame is chosen over justice. It forces us to ask, how many more lives were swallowed by that same silence? The girl's story eventually faded into the background, tucked away in yellowing medical files and half-buried whispers passed down in small towns that preferred forgetting over remembering. Her name is not spoken, her grave not marked with anything that tells of the suffering she endured. And yet, the fragments that remain ensure that she is not entirely erased. She is remembered not for who she was, but for what was done to her. That is the most haunting part of all. She was never given the dignity of her own narrative. She lived and died as a shadow, her childhood stolen, her body forced into roles it could not bear, her identity consumed by shame. And when her story reached the outside world, she became an object of horror rather than compassion, a warning about inbreeding rather than a plea for justice. But when we peel back the silence, we see the truth. She was a child, 9 years old. She should have been learning to read, to laugh, to play. Instead, she carried her uncle's child. Instead, she became a mother before she was even a teenager. That is the weight of generational secrecy, of communities that choose silence over justice, of families that devour their own. Stories like hers remind us that the past is never as far away as we think. These were not medieval tales or legends from another continent. They happened here, in the heart of America, within living memory. And the silence that allowed it then still lingers now, in places where families hide their darkest truths, where bloodlines twist inward, where shame is stronger than law. Perhaps the most unsettling thought is this. She was not the only one. She was simply the one history could not completely erase. For every record we uncover, there are countless more that never made it to paper, families that buried their victims along with their secrets, and some of those families are still out there, den in forgotten corners of the country, repeating patterns no one dares expose. So when we tell her story, we are not just unearthing one tragedy, we are unearthing a pattern, a truth America has tried to bury. And as long as we keep pulling at that thread, we will find more, always more. Thank you for watching. If you found this story important, haunting, or disturbing, please leave a comment below and let us know what part stayed with you the most. Don't forget to like and subscribe so these hidden histories continue to surface. Because the past is never dead, it waits in silence, just like she did.